So, as I was just asking the Lord what He wanted me to preach this morning, I felt like He wants us to, as we move forward, He wants us to have a certain mindset about prayer. He wants to remind us, how we are to think, specifically involving prayer. And I believe He wanted me to use it from this story. Is the story about Elisha in 2 Kings chapter 4. And we're mainly going to be in the second half of the chapter, but I'm just going to read a few verses right off the bat so we get the context of what exactly is happening here. So in 2 Kings chapter 4, starting in verse 8, we have Elisha and his encounter with the Shunammite woman. And so it says in verse 8, one day Elisha went on to Shunem, where a wealthy woman lived, who urged him to eat some food. So whenever he passed that way, he would turn in there to eat food. And she said to her husband, "Behold now, I know that this is a holy man of God who is continually passing our way. Let us make a small room on the roof with walls and put there for him a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp. So whenever he comes to us, he can go in there." One day he came there, and he turned into the chamber, and he rested there. And he said to Gehazi, his servant, "Call the Shunammite." When he had called her, she stood before him. And he said to him, "Say now to her, see, you've taken all this trouble for us, but what can we do for you? Would you have a word spoken on your behalf to the king or to the commander of the army?" And she answered, "I dwell among my own people." And he said, "What then is to be done for her?" Gehazi answered, "Well, she has no son, and her husband is old." He said, "Call her." And when he had called her, she stood in the doorway. And he said, "At this season, about this time next year, you shall embrace a son." And she said, "No, my lord, O man of God, do not lie to your servant." But the woman conceived, and she bore a son about that time, the following spring, just as Elisha had said to her. So, these people are taking care of the prophet, and he says, "Well, what can we do for you? How can we bless you?" And then he says, "You're gonna have a baby." And she says, "Don't do that to me. Don't lie to me and tell me I'm gonna get pregnant." And behold, she did. Some time passes by, and then in verse 18 it says, "When the child had grown, he went out one day to his father among the reapers, and he said to his father, 'Oh, my head, my head!' And the father said to his servant, 'Carry him to his mother.' And when he had lifted him and brought him to his mother, the child sat on her lap till noon, and then he died." A lot of speculation has gone on about what exactly happened. How old was the child? Probably was still very young. I mean, I have a hard time believing a 16-year-old is going to be sitting on his mother's lap until noon, but I guess it's possible. But I would assume maybe 10 or younger. We don't know, and we don't know what happened. I mean, some people speculate maybe he had heat stroke, which would have made a lot of sense. It doesn't really matter exactly what happened to him, but what does matter is the fact that he died. This baby that was a gift from God is now dead. And what I really want us to focus on this morning is the attitude of the mother, how she handled this, and then how did Elisha handle it. And the Lord wants us to learn some things about prayer and faith, looking at how both of them handled this situation. So if we continue in verse 21 of 2 Kings 4, after the boy died, it says, "And she went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God and shut the door behind him and went out. Then she called to her husband and said, 'Send me one of the servants and one of the donkeys, that I may quickly go to the man of God and come back again.'" Notice what her immediate action is. She takes her dead son and puts him on Elisha's bed. That's kind of weird. Why is there this immediate focus on Elisha in this? Well, back in the Old Testament, God mainly spoke through his prophets. And pretty much everybody knew that, right? They knew who the prophets in the land were, and if they wanted to have an interaction with God, they would always go to the prophets, and they would want the prophet to speak to God on their behalf. So this woman knew that God had worked through Elisha to give her a son, right? She knew, there was no confusion about where this son came. God gave her this son and used Elisha to tell her this news that she was going to have a son. So therefore, she knew this child came from God. So she knew the only person that can do anything about it is God. And since God worked through Elisha, she put the boy on Elisha's bed. And like I mentioned, it wasn't that she thought Elisha would be the one to fix it. No. She knew God would fix it, but she believed God was working through Elisha. That's why she put him in Elisha's bed. The woman, she recognized the source of her help, and she didn't let herself get confused about who was the one that could help her in this situation. She didn't go to anybody else but God. And so many Christians today don't realize, and it's easy to maybe forget sometimes, that everything we have is from God. He is the source, and He alone has the power to work in a situation. He alone has, anything we have is from Him. Any power anybody else seems to have is from God anyway. It's all from Him. But oftentimes, the last person we go to is God. We do everything we can do, and then, okay, I guess I might as well pray about it now because everything else failed. When it's like, that's the first thing we should be doing. Only God can touch us and help us. Isaiah 58:11 says, "And the Lord will guide you continually, and He will satisfy your desire in scorched places, and He will make your bones strong, and you shall be like a watered garden, like a spring of water whose waters do not fail." Only God can supply our needs. Philippians 4:19, Paul says, "My God will supply every need of yours according to His riches and glory in Christ Jesus." And only God can do the impossible. Ephesians 3:20 and 21, Paul says, "Now to Him who is able to do far more abundantly than we could ever ask or even think, according to the power that is at work within us." Our brains cannot even fathom the things God is able to accomplish. He can heal the sick. He can raise the dead, physically and spiritually. We all know. We all know people that are so against God in life that it seems impossible for them to change. Right? We might have unsaved family members and friends that it feels like, man, they're never going to come to God. They're never, it's never going to get through to them. Well, what's the test for how we know whether or not God can do something? Well, He can do more than we could ever ask or dream of. So if you can think of it, God can do it, basically. This Shunammite woman knew only God could help her. She knew it was only Him, and I think this is the main cause of a lot of prayerlessness today. A big reason why people don't pray is because they don't really believe everything comes from God, and that He's the only one. It's interesting. When I was at the hospital yesterday, I was talking to Norman and Nancy, and they were telling me about one of their relatives. I can't remember his name, but he got saved, and he kind of became a Nazarene preacher, and he planted some churches. And Norman was just talking about when he would preach, that the Spirit of God was upon him so much that every time he would preach, people would run to the altars, and we were talking about that, and kind of how, like, you don't see that a lot anymore. And I said, well, the reason why is because people don't pray like they did. Decades and decades and decades ago, man, a lot of churches, they don't pray like they used to. And there's a direct correlation. If we're not seeking the face of God, we're not going to see full altars. We're not going to, because it's the power of God. And like you said, Randy, we don't need laser lights or smoke machines or any of that stuff. And yes, there are churches that do use smoke machines. I don't know why in the world they do it, but I've seen them do it. And like that's not going to do anything. It's I don't know if people if they think, I don't know, they want the appearance of the Holy Spirit, but it's like, man, we need to realize that if God is not moving, nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to, and this Shunammite woman, she knew that. So let's get to the strangest thing about this story. This woman's son dies in her lap, and she puts him in Elisha's bed. Now, last I checked, that's not what you do with dead bodies. When someone dies, you prepare the funeral, you dig a hole in the ground, or you get an urn ready for their ashes. You don't put them in somebody's bed. Why did she do that? That's just weird. Why did she walked him up to this area and she lays him in Elisha's bed and then walks away? Why didn't they get a funeral prepared, right? There's probably other families at that time who lost children, and they immediately, go to the local priest or whatever, and they start getting the preparations ready for the funeral. They start getting the grave ready or whatever. But she puts that child in a bed. Why? Because she didn't believe he was going to stay dead. That's why she did it. She didn't treat him as if he was dead. That's what was going on. And this is an amazing example of real faith here. Can you imagine this? So imagine, this child dies. They get the funeral preparations. They dig a hole or they go to a cave or whatever, and they bury the body. And then she goes to Elisha and says, Elisha, will you raise my son from the dead? What do you think Elijah's reaction would be? He'd be like, but you already buried him. You already think he's dead. Why? You don't really believe he can be healed because you already think he's dead. I think, and this is something we need to ask ourselves, how do you think God feels when we come to him with a prayer request that we've already buried? When you come to him and say, oh God, save my lost cousin, but in your mind, you've already decided he's never going to be saved. What do you think God thinks of? That's not faith. That's not faith. But why of all places did the woman put her dead son in this bed of all places? You put, when you have a child, you put them in a bed right when they fall asleep. You don't put them in there when they're dead. This woman did not even view her son as being dead at all. I think she viewed him as just being asleep. How did she do that? How was she able to not look at what was right? The reality in front of her was that her son is dead. It's over. You had a few nice years. Suck it up, get over it, move on. That's the reality. That's what's actually happening. But she wasn't looking at that reality. She was looking at something else. What was she looking at? Tiffany spoiled this verse. 2 Corinthians 5, 6, and 7. So we are always of good courage. We know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord, for we walk by faith, not by sight. She wasn't looking at the situation with physical eyes. She was looking at it through faith. And the eyes of faith said, this child's not dead. And I tell you what, I just got to be honest with that. This was going through my head, on Thursday. Doug is lying there brain dead in a bed. And here it's like, okay, I want him to be healed. But, and there's that, I'm just being honest with you. There's that wrestling. I don't know, can I believe that he'll be healed? Can I really, that's why I texted my friend, said, pray for faith, because I was sitting there, I'm like, God, I want him to be healed. You can heal him. I don't know if I believe he can actually be healed. I'm being honest with you. Because sometimes that does happen. There are people there are people that go without oxygen longer than Doug did. And boom, they wake up. And it happens, but it's like, but I'm looking at it, I'm thinking about him in that bed, and I'm thinking, what, man, can I really believe that he's, I don't know. But all I know is when we went in there and I anointed him, I felt this confidence, it's interesting. One of the gifts of the Spirit in 1 Corinthians is the gift of faith. And the thing is, Paul says that not everybody has all the gifts of the Spirit. The Holy Spirit will give as he sees fit. So Paul doesn't say, oh, everybody has every gift of the Spirit. No. But you say, but the gift of faith, we're always supposed to have faith. But what is the gift of faith? And my best understanding is something that George Mueller said. I don't know if you've heard of George Mueller, but he was ran an orphanage, 1800s, I think. And I'll have to talk about him sometime. And he prayed, and God would provide everything for the orphans. But he believed the gift of faith is when there's a situation that happens, and maybe normally you wouldn't have the faith to pray for a certain thing to happen, but God supernaturally gives you this incredible faith that you don't normally have, and basically gives you this special faith and says, pray for this because I'm going to do this. It's a supernatural faith where God says, I want you to believe for this miracle because I'm about to do it. And I think that's a good definition, just an incredibly supernatural, abnormal faith for something that's impossible. And when we were praying over Doug, I felt this presence of God. I felt this confidence as I was praying for him. Like didn't doubt anything. I was just like, no doubt. And like I said, and I believe God answered the prayer, because my main prayer was that he would be saved. And I thank God. And then Tiffany saw that cross on his nose, and I just don't think that's a coincidence. I can't prove that it's not, but I just, the way everything worked out, and I guess maybe it's like you had to be there. When God is present somewhere, you can't describe it. There's no words. You just got to be there. And God was there. And I do believe that God, in a few moments, God gave us the ability to really look through it with the eyes of faith. He really did. But this whole situation makes me think of a story with Jesus in Mark 5. Of Mark 5:35, it says, while Jesus was speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said to a ruler, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, don't be afraid, only believe. And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue. Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he entered, he said to them, why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside. He took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in there where the child was. And he took her by the hand and he said, Talitha Kumi, which means little girl, get up. And immediately the girl got up and began walking. And they were all overcome with amazement. The Shunammite woman, she looked at everything, as Tiffany was saying this morning, we have to have an upward gaze. And that's part of the problem today is we have so many things that are distracting us from looking at Jesus with everything. We have so many things. We have one in our pockets. It's our phone. And it's like if we're looking down at what's on our phone instead of up at him, we're going to be distracted. If all we're looking at is all the garbage going on in the world or just getting distracted by scrolling and watching so many different things, and we're never looking at Jesus, we're not going to have faith. And we're not going to know what we're not going to be able to believe in him. We're not going to know what he wants. We're just going to be distracted and distraught and depressed and miserable. We have to keep looking at him in everything. And that's what the Lord wants us to do, is to look at everything through the lens of how God sees it and what God thinks. And this woman, she was looking at everything the way that God would want her to look at it, through the eyes of faith. But what can we learn from Elisha? Elisha did some weird stuff too in this story. So if we go to Elisha, if we go back, 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 22, the woman called to her husband and said, send me one of the servants and one of the donkeys that I may quickly go to the man of God and come back again. And he said, why will you go to him today? It is neither new moon nor Sabbath. She said, all is well. Then she saddled the donkey and said to her servant, urge the animal on. Do not slacken the pace for me unless I tell you. So she set out and came to the man of God at Mount Carmel. When the man of God saw her coming, he said to Gehazi, his servant, look, there's the Shunammite. Run at once to meet her and say to her, is all well with you? Is all well with your husband? Is all well with the child? And she answered, all is well. And when she came to the mountain to the man of God, she caught a hold of his feet. And Gehazi came to push her away. But the man of God said, leave her alone, for she is in bitter distress. And the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me. That last verse always gets my attention. Elisha said, I know something's wrong, but God hasn't told me what it is. We see something very important here. Elisha must have lived completely dependent on the voice of God. As soon as a situation arises, the first thing Elisha does is listen to God. God, talk to me, God, what's going on here? And when God doesn't say anything, Elisha doesn't move. I gotta wait. I'm waiting. I'm not going to move until God talks to me about what's going on. He doesn't try to figure it out on his own, right? He doesn't trust himself to work in the situation. He doesn't dare leave God behind and try to take care of it by himself. How many times do we do that? When was the last time you stopped and depended on God to inform you about a situation? And this is why so many churches end up being unhealthy, is because they end up depending on their own ideas and their own thoughts instead of waiting for God. And you want to know what happens when you stop waiting and listening to God? I'll show you what happens. 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 3. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel, the boy Samuel, was lying down in the temple of the Lord where the ark of God was. And the Lord called to Samuel, and he said, "Here I am." And he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, you called me." But Eli said, "I didn't say anything. Go lay down again." So he went and lay down. The Lord called again. The Lord said, "Samuel." Samuel arose and went to Eli and said, "Yeah, what? You called me." But again, Eli said, "I didn't say anything. Go lay down." Now Samuel did not yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not yet been revealed to him. And the Lord called Samuel again a third time, and he arose and went to Eli. And he said, "Here I am, for you called me." Then Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Eli was the high priest. High priest is the guy that's supposed to know God. Why couldn't Eli? Why did it take him 3 times to know that it was God calling Samuel? 3 times. Why didn't he know the first time? Because he had forgotten what it was like to listen to the Lord. He forgot his voice. He couldn't understand. Because if you read about Samuel, he was not following God the way he should. If you read about his 2 children were awful, he wasn't raising them to follow the Lord. They were horrible children doing sinful things in the temple. When you ignore God's voice in your life, you end up forgetting what it even sounds like. And then God tries to speak to you, and you have no idea it's him. And you ignore him. And then Satan comes along and says, "Oh, I'm God. Listen to me." And when you get to a place where you can't tell the difference between the voice of Satan and the voice of God, and if you don't think that can happen, it can happen. It can happen. I believe it's the book of Amos. If you haven't read Amos in a while, it's one of those books just where basically God tells Amos to tell Israel how horrible they are and how he's going to kill them. It really is. It's a very there was one many years ago. I was asking Claire. I was like, "Hey, what book of the Bible do you want me to read to you?" And she said Amos. And after like the 2nd chapter, I was like, "We're not going to read Amos anymore." She's like, "Why not?" I'm like, "Well, because I don't know. I mean, God, thus saith the Lord, you're all going to die. Good night." I mean, I'm like, we're going to read something a little more. We're going to wait for a little bit on Amos. But one of the things God has Amos say to the people is that there will be a famine on hearing the voice of the Lord. And it's interesting because when I first read that, I thought God was saying, "Hey, I'm not going to speak to you." That's not what God says. He says there'll be a famine of hearing the voice of the Lord. He doesn't say he'll stop speaking. He says you won't be able to hear me when I speak anymore. And that's a terrifying thought, to think that even when God speaks, you won't have any idea that it's him. Man. So back to this story, verse 28, 2 Kings 4. Then the woman said to Elisha, "Did I ask you to give me a son? Did I not say, 'Don't deceive me'?" And he said, and it's interesting. She says, "I told you, don't lie to me about my son." And he knew exactly what happened. He's like, uh-oh. And he said to Gehazi, "Tie up your garment, take my staff in your hand, and go. If you meet anyone, don't greet him. And if anyone greets you, do not reply, and lay my staff on the face of the child." Then the mother of the child said, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So he arose and followed her. Gehazi went on ahead and laid the staff on the face of the child, but there was no sound, no sign of life. Therefore he returned to meet him and told him the child was not awakened. So Elisha tells Gehazi, "Get there now, put my staff on the child's face." Meanwhile, the mother's like, "I'm not leaving," which is another attitude of prayer. She's like, "I'm not moving until you do something." And that's how we need to be with God. God, I'm not going to shut up until you do this. You need to answer this situation, and I'm not stopping until you do this. Gehazi comes back. Didn't work. Nothing happened. And this is weird. Why did he do that? Why did he tell Gehazi to take the staff and go lay it on the child, especially if it failed? I mean, did Elisha think it would work? Because remember, we just saw an example of Elisha not moving until God speaks. He's like, "Wait, God, there's something wrong, but God hasn't told me yet." Right? Elisha's not moving. Elisha's only doing what God's telling him to do. So did God tell Elisha to have Gehazi put the staff on the child's face? Well, if he did, then why didn't it do anything? And there's a lot of ideas and theories as to what in the world this means. And after thinking about it and praying about it, I can't 100% say this is exactly it, but my conclusion is I think Elisha knew the staff wouldn't do anything. I think he knew it wouldn't work. One idea that's been around for a long time is that if somebody has some sort of miracle working power, that anything they touch is also going to have this miracle working power. We do see that at times in the Bible, right? In the book of Acts, Peter's shadow falls on people and heals them. You see them taking a garment and praying on a garment and then having somebody take that garment to somebody and it does heal them. So you see that stuff. And I'm sure that was around on Elisha's day. I'm sure people thought, "Oh, the prophet has touched this. Take it to that person." And maybe there were times when that would work. But I think Elisha wants to make a statement. I think he wants to make it clear that items such as a staff have no power on their own. There's something magical about an object by itself. I think Elijah wanted it to be seen that the only way anything was going to happen is if we call upon God. I think he wanted that to be clear, that crying out to God in prayer is the only solution. So verse 32, when Elisha came into the house, he saw the child lying dead on his bed. So he went in and he shut the door behind the two of them, and he prayed to the Lord. Elisha knew that's the only thing that's going to make a difference, is calling upon God. Then he went up and he laid on the child. He put his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, and his hands on his hands. And as he stretched himself upon him, the flesh of the child became warm. Then he got up again, and he walked once back and forth in the house, and he went up and he did it again, stretched himself on the child. The child sneezed 7 times, and the child opened his eyes. Now, Elisha does a lot here, a lot. He lays on the boy, gets up, walks around, lays on him again. Why is he doing this? I mean, I've never thought to do that when I'm praying for somebody. Where do you think he got that from? He got it from his mentor, Elijah. Back in 1 Kings 17, you might remember the story of the widow and the oil, right? Where the widow had no more oil. And Elisha says, pour this into all the containers you can find and you'll have unlimited oil, that whole story. Well, in 1 Kings 17, it says, after this, the son of that woman, the mistress of the house, became ill. And his illness was so severe, there was no breath left in him. And she said to Elijah, "What have you against me, O man of God? You have come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and cause the death of my son." And he said to her, "Give me your son." And he took him from her arms and carried him up into the upper chamber where he lodged and laid him on his own bed. And in verse 21, it says that he stretched himself on the child. Elisha did the same thing that Elijah did. He's like, well, my mentor, the Lord led him to do this, so I'm going to do the same thing. But was there something magical in him laying on the child? No. Once again, 2 Kings 4:32-33, when Elisha came into the house, he saw the child lying dead on his bed. So he went in and shut the door behind the two of them and prayed to the Lord. He learned that from his mentor, Elijah. Back in 1 Kings again, 17, with that boy, Elisha cried to the Lord, "O Lord my God, have you brought calamity up even upon the widow with whom I sojourn by killing her son?" Then he stretched himself upon the child 3 times and cried to the Lord, "O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again." And the Lord listened to the voice of Elisha, and the life of the child came into him again, and he revived. Man, I just love that. He cried to the Lord, and the Lord listened and answered. It's just... And then when we go to the New Testament, hundreds of years later, when the Apostle James is writing to a church, he's wanting them to understand how effective prayer is. And he says this to them in James 5, 16 through 18. "Therefore, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. The prayer of a righteous person has great power as it is working. Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed fervently that it might not rain. And for 3 years and 6 months, it did not rain on the earth. And then he prayed again, and heaven gave rain, and the earth bore its fruit." So as we come to a close this morning, the Lord wants us to remember that calling upon him in prayer is the most powerful thing that any human being could possibly do. There's no limit to what we can see. And we're told that if we pray according to his will, and we know his will through his written word, if we see what he desires in his word, he desires to restore, he desires to save, he desires to heal, he desires to reverse all the effects of sin and Satan. And so if we are in this church, in this community, and we're praying for the very things that Jesus wants to accomplish, he will do it if we believe. And so we need to have no doubt in our minds that we will see the glory of the Lord come down. We will see people saved. We'll see people healed. We'll see people delivered. But James also says in chapter 4, you have not because you ask not. So God's saying to us this morning, if you don't want to pray, okay, you don't have to, but I won't do anything. But if you do pray with faith, I will do everything. And so that's what the Lord wants us to take away from this as we close this morning. It's interesting. The song that the Lord put in my head for us to normally, if Jeanette's here, we'll sing at the end. And the song that he put in my head, because usually when I preach on prayer, I love the song "Sweet Hour of Prayer," but the song that he put in my mind was "Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus." Because that when all is said and done, we need to be looking up at him throughout all of it. We need to be gazing on him. Peter was walking on water until he looked away from Jesus. And then he began to just flounder.